Hey, what's up, guys? So, this is going to be episode one of a new series I'm starting. The series is going to be titled Cigars for Beginners. The purpose of the series is so that I can help pass down some of the knowledge that I've gained through years of cigar smoking, because as we all know, this hobby comes with a lot of information, and a lot of misinformation. And even with that information, it's still a lot of trial and error to practically apply a lot of that information, because it really just depends. It depends on your personal preferences, it depends on your environment, it depends on your budget, etc. So hopefully these videos help somebody expedite that learning curve that can take some of us years to really find, our specific preferences and find out the things that work for us. So today's episode one, and this is going to be on humidity. So humidity is one of those things that for cigar smokers, it's one of the most crucial and fundamental aspects of cigar smoking, but it's also one of the most confusing aspects of cigar culture. What is humidity? So simply put, humidity is the amount of moisture or the amount of water that is in the air in a given environment. Just based off of that explanation, you can already see how this is going to apply to cigars. So based off of however much water is in the air, that is going to determine the level of humidity, which is measured in percentages in a particular environment. It could be in your house, it could be outside, it could be in your humidor, it could be in your refrigerator. That said, there is no such thing as the humidity of a solid object. Again, humidity only applies to the air in a given environment, right? So a cigar in and of itself doesn't have a humidity. It has a moisture content. And that's what you get out of solid objects. Wood can have a moisture content level, fabric can have a moisture content level, you have a moisture content level, and cigars have a moisture content level. Now, for reference, the proper moisture content level of a cigar is a range between 12 and 14%. Now, maybe you like your cigars a bit on the wetter side, maybe you like them a bit on the drier side, and there's some room for play with that 12 to 14%. You can go a little bit higher, you can go a little bit lower, but you also have to understand the pros and cons of going higher and lower. So if you're above that 14%, you run the risk of having draw issues, burn issues, or God forbid, mold develop on your cigars. And if you're under that 12%, you run the risk of drying up the oils in the cigar, which can cause the cigar to have a harsh or acrid or taste, or even no flavor whatsoever. Basically, it'll taste like you're smoking burning dead leaves, right, as opposed to your favorite stick. Also, you can get cracking, you can get your cigars exploding, and there's even scenarios where your cigars might look fine, but then the moment you go to smoke them, they start to unravel and explode on you, right? So typically you do want to keep your cigars within that 12 to 14%. And while that sounds like a small range, it takes a lot to move your cigars above that 14% or below that 14%. You have to go to some pretty extremes in the way that you store your cigars in order to push them, out of that range. The main question you'll get a lot, and this even among, experts and experienced smokers, you'll get a lot of people with a lot of different suggestions as to what is the proper humidity to store your cigars at. The easiest thing to do is just give you a broad range, right? Between 60 and 70% humidity, right? If you're between 60 and 70% humidity, your cigars are going to be fine. Another thing to consider is your RH. So we talked about humidity. Now let's talk about relative humidity. Now, relative humidity is exactly what it sounds like. It's the humidity relative to something. In this case, it's the humidity relative to temperature. You can have your cigars stored in a humidor that says 70% humidity, right? But if your temperature is 75 degrees, you have to understand that 70% humidity is not equal to 70% humidity at 70 degrees or 65 degrees or 60 degrees. The warmer the air is, the more moisture that air can hold. So 65% or 70% is not created equal. And that also reflects, in a lot of cases, you'll see that you might put a 65% or even a 70% boveda pack in your humidor, but your hygrometer, which is an entirely different conversation, we'll get to that too, your hygrometer might read 63%. And you're wondering why your 70% boveda pack, your 72% boveda pack is reading 63%. Well, if you look at the temperature aspect, there's a really good chance that you're actually storing your cigars in a much cooler environment, right? You might be storing that cigar at 63 degrees. And so you might be getting what you think is an inaccurate reading based off of your Govee or whatever it is you use, whatever your hygrometer is. And in reality, your boveda pack is doing its job, but you're storing it at a cooler temperature. Or you might have a 65% boveda in there and it's reading 75% humidity because you have your cigar stored at 80 degrees, right? That's why we have this thing called 70 and 70. And most people just adhere to that because it's easier, right? So 70 and 70, which is 70 degrees at 70% humidity. That's usually the most agreed upon marker to try and hit in terms of storing your cigars at a proper humidity level. But you have a much broader range, okay? You have a much broader range than that. And what I like to do personally is store my cigars as close to 70 degrees as possible, but I also like to keep the humidity a bit lower. So usually for me, it'll be 65 to 68, more or less. And there's no need to like sweat it. There's no need to fret, right? If you can't quite get your humidity exactly where you want it because you have that range. So if you are a beginner, I do recommend that you go with 70 and 70, not because I think it's ideal, but because it's the easiest thing to do. And then you go from that 70 and 70, and then you play around with it. You start experimenting with lower humidities. You start experimenting with potentially higher humidities, although I don't recommend to go higher than 70 and 70. And one of the main reasons why I don't like 70 and 70 is because that does put you on the upper end of range for storing your cigars in proper humidity, because once it starts creeping up above 70, which can happen if the temperature changes, it can happen if, for whatever reason, maybe you add new cigars and those cigars are overly humidified. Next thing you know, your whole humidor is sitting at 72, 73 degrees. The reason why I don't like that is because you start to run the risk of having mold. So I do recommend that most people shoot for an RH in the mid 60s at roughly 70 degrees. But again, as a beginner, it's just a good baseline point to start, and then you can start playing around with it from there. The reason why the temperature is super important. The temperature is important here because it gives you a baseline. Because again, 70% humidity at 65 degrees versus 70% humidity at 70 degrees is way different. I mean, the amount of moisture in the air at 70 degrees versus 65 degrees is exponentially different. Okay, so we try to control. When it comes to storing cigars, we're trying to control for as many variables as possible. So the whole purpose of keeping temperature at 70 or as close to 70 degrees as you can is simply because it allows you to control for a variable. And the more variables you can control for, the more consistent of a result you can get from your cigars, and the less you have to worry about it. If you're going to properly store your cigar, there's several types of containers you can use. So you can use a basic wooden humidor lined with Spanish cedar. You can use a glass top, which I also don't recommend, as awesome as it looks and allows you to see your cigars without having to open the humidor. Glass top humidors usually leak humidity, I'm sure there's certain things you can do. You can buy higher quality glass top humidors. You could use like silicone or some sort of sealant around the edges of like the glass to kind of prevent as much leakage as possible. But typically most glass top humidors, in my opinion, it's just not worth it unless you really are into the aesthetic. You can also use acrylic humidors, which are made entirely of, obviously, acrylic. They're going to be great for sealing in moisture, although they're not as elegant as wooden or glass top wooden humidors. And then you also have tupper doors and cooler doors. And you have wine doors. So what a tupper door is just going to be a Tupperware, a plastic container. Typically, if it has some sort of gasket around the edge, it's going to prevent moisture loss. A cooler door is essentially a cooler of some sort. It could be like a beer cooler, which you put drinks in. A wine door is going to be basically a wine cooler. Usually those are electric, but they don't necessarily have to be, depending on what your setup is. And with those are usually in the style now. So they have large glass fronts. They seal around the edges. They're usually electric, so they have like built-in hygrometers that are electric, built-in temperature sensors that are electric. They don't always have the hygrometers. It depends on whether it was converted or whether it was specifically designed to hold cigars, but it's essentially a wine cooler, something you would keep bottles of wine in, because wine is also one of those things you kind of want to control for as many variables as you can, particularly temperature, which is why most converted wine doors don't necessarily have built-in hygrometers, because it's largely irrelevant. But they usually do have some sort of temperature sensor. And you see a lot of companies now purposefully converting wine coolers or wine cooler like designs and kind of building them specifically for cigars. So they'll have the built-in hygrometer, etc. And then one of the things I do like about wine doors is if you get a big enough one, it typically has very solid storage. Now, me personally, I prefer tupper doors. I have a very extensive collection, and a lot of people always say, well, why don't you just get, a cabinet humidor or a cooler door or a wine door, something that's a bit nicer to display my collection in. Well, the reason why I prefer tupper doors personally is because I spend a lot of money on cigars. I don't want to spend a ton of money on how I store my cigars. It allows me to put maximum funds towards my cigar hobby and the actual quality and quantity of the cigars that I get. I mean, these things are very hardy. They can be stacked on each other. I don't have to worry about breaking it or moving it. If these things fall or what environment I store them in, they're going to do their job, period. I also use ones that are weather and dust proof. So they don't leak. They have gaskets. They're waterproof. They don't let in dust. And more importantly, they're going to keep that environment as stable as possible. Humidors didn't exist for the majority of cigar smoking history. People have smoked cigars for thousands of years. Cigars, in the way we know them, for hundreds of years at least. And cigars, and humidors weren't really a part of that, except within the last 100 years and 100 plus years, right? So the first cigar humidor was actually invented by Alfred Dunhill in 1907. And it was just a thick wooden box lined with Spanish cedar. And even then, it didn't become popular among cigar smokers until decades later. Because prior to that, and even during that, a lot of people just opted to store their cigars in their basements, which were naturally dark and damp to begin with, so they didn't have to worry about humidification. And that leads me to my number one rule when storing your cigars. Don't overthink it. This is something that I see a lot among cigar smokers. People overthink the storage of their cigars. And it's understandable. You spend a lot of money on these things. It's not something you want to take lightly. But you also have to understand that, again, for most of cigar smoking history, this wasn't something that was overly thought. You take your cigars, you keep them in the box, you put them in your basement, and then you go get one every once in a while, check on them, etc. Even nowadays, you have to remember that when cigars are shipped out from the manufacturer, they spend weeks, even months, in a shipping container. And a lot of these cigars don't come humidified, right? They're taken out, they're put in cellophane, they're packaged up, and then they're sent all over the world. So a cigar that's stored in slightly less than optimal conditions in your house, in your garage, in your basement, whatever, is likely going to be fine. But that said, you do want to take care of your cigars. You don't want to neglect them. Again, you store them in environments that are too dry and they'll split, they'll crack, the oils will dry up and you won't get a great smoking experience. You store them too moist and you'll have burn issues and you'll have mold issues. But again, there's a pretty large range that you can store your cigars at without worrying about adverse effects. And again, if Fuente or Davidoff or whoever isn't worried about their cigars being shipped across the Atlantic or halfway around the world and then spending months in some shipping container and then probably weeks in an improperly humidified cabinet in some smoke shop or some cigar lounge or whatever, it's really not much for you to worry about either. So don't overthink it. Don't stress yourself out about it. But some tools that you can use, right, in order to properly assess the conditions that you're keeping your cigars in. A simple hygrometer. So this is a cheap Amazon hygrometer. I do calibrate my hygrometers. And there's multiple ways you can do that. You can do the salt test. Me, I like to just use a Boveda pack. And the reason why I use a Boveda pack is because a Boveda pack is just salt and water. It's salt, it's water, in their proprietary two-way packets that allow moisture in and allow moisture out. But take your hygrometer, put it in an airtight container or a Ziploc bag with a Boveda pack, leave it there for a day or two, check on it. If it's reading usually plus or minus 2% at the worst, relative to the Boveda pack or whatever moisture, relative to the Boveda pack or the salt water solution, whatever it is you're using to actually calibrate your hygrometer, then chances are your hygrometer's fine. Another thing I do use, obviously, Boveda packs. Now, you don't have to use Boveda packs. There's Boost, there's Cigar packs, there's Oasis humidifiers, which are usually for cabinet humidors. You could even just use a bowl of water, although I don't recommend that because there's no real way to control how much you're humidifying your cigars, and it requires you to check on them a lot to make sure that you're not overly humidifying them and to make sure that you don't have any mold issues growing. Also, with water, you got to make sure you're using distilled water. You don't want to use spring water, tap water, purified water. You want to use distilled water because anything other than that, and you're almost guaranteed to run into mold issues. Even if you do recharge these, which you can recharge these, I don't recommend necessarily recharging these, but this particular size, I should say, this is a 320 gram Boveda pack. Okay, this is the equivalent of like 5 60 gram Boveda packs. And if you know anything, a 60 gram Boveda pack in a wooden humidor will usually humidify about 25 cigars, and in a plastic Tupperware of some sort, as long as it's airtight, it'll usually humidify about 50 to 75 cigars, even upwards of 100, honestly. And you usually won't have any real issues. Main takeaways here. Don't over humidify your cigars. Don't under humidify your cigars. You have a pretty big range of humidity that you can store your cigars at before you do either of those things. Go with the storage option that works the best for you based off of your budget, the amount of space you have, the amount of cigars you have, etc. And don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Do not stress out about it. Cigars will be fine. They're pretty tough. So that's episode 1 of Cigars for Beginners, and hopefully that has helped somebody.